I can jump down from here.
He was the heartbeat of the palace, the boy who made even the coldest walls echo with laughter. But then, silence. Prince Louis, the cheeky, vibrant, youngest royal, suddenly stopped smiling. No one noticed at first, but now King Charles and Prince William are confirming what everyone feared. Something is heartbreakingly wrong with Louis, and the truth behind it is even more haunting. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For years, Louis had been the royal family's living reminder that even in a world shaped by duty, protocol, and relentless public judgment, innocence still existed. He was the child who could transform a room with a single burst of laughter. He was the spark that made palace staff lighten their steps. The little whirlwind who softened Catherine's exhaustion and gave William a reason to breathe on the hardest days. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. It began with the small things, the moments no one expected to matter. A missed giggle here, a quiet breakfast there. His once bouncing footsteps softened until they barely made a sound. The boy who used to ask 1,000 questions a day now stared at his cereal as though he had nothing left to say. At first, everyone chalked it up to stress, a natural response to the whirlwind surrounding Catherine's health. Children absorbed fear quietly, they thought. He just needs time. But the truth was creeping in like a silent fog, and nobody realized how quickly it was filling the room. William noticed it in the evenings when Louis no longer raced into his arms. Instead, he lingered in doorways, hesitant, watching but not joining. Catherine noticed it in the mornings when she reached for him and found not excitement, but a cold distance she couldn't understand. Even the staff felt it, the absence of the little prince who used to brighten their routines. Something inside him was dimming, and no one could name the cause. And yet, because life in the palace demands constant motion, the warning signs were layered beneath daily obligations. Catherine, fighting her own battle against illness, tried to keep her world afloat. William, managing the weight of royal duty, told himself that Louis simply needed reassurance. But the truth neither of them could face was far more dangerous than a child's fleeting sadness. Behind Louis's silence was a storm building quietly, one that none of them could see. A heaviness sat in the air around him, a heaviness no child should carry. His once vibrant eyes lost their shine, and even the sunshine spilling into Adelaide Cottage seemed unable to reach him. Everyone kept waiting for the laughter to return. Everyone kept believing it would. But laughter cannot return when something deeper is stealing its place. The palace had lost its spark, and none of them yet understood why. But it wasn't just sadness. It was something deeper, darker, and devastating. And it would soon bring the palace to its knees. One moment he was curled in bed, the next his body burning with fever, his breath shallow. Catherine's scream shattered the still morning calm, and within minutes, emergency protocols were activated. It was no longer speculation. Prince Louis was slipping, and no one knew why. Catherine had entered her son's room, expecting just another routine morning. But the moment her hand touched his forehead, a chill ran through her spine. His skin was scalding. His small body trembled beneath the sheets, drenched in sweat. His eyelids fluttered, unfocused, barely aware of her voice. She called for William with a tone he hadn't heard since her cancer diagnosis, and that was enough to make his blood run cold. He ran, barefoot, through the corridor and into the room, only to find his son limp, burning, and barely conscious. Without hesitation, William gathered Louis into his arms. He could feel how much lighter his son had become in recent weeks. He had tried to dismiss the weight loss as temporary stress, the result of emotional exhaustion after Catherine's illness. But this moment shattered all denial. As he held Louis's fragile frame, something inside him broke. The convoy to the hospital was mobilized within minutes. Security swept the halls, clearing the way. Medical bags were thrown into vehicles. A royal emergency line was triggered, one that hadn't been used in decades. Catherine cradled Louis in the back seat, whispering to him through her panic. William sat opposite, one hand clenched into a fist, trying not to let his fears spiral into chaos. Red lights seemed to last forever. Every second, Louis's breathing grew more shallow. At the hospital, a whirlwind of action surrounded them. Nurses rushed forward, doctors issued urgent commands, and Louis was wheeled away with tubes already being inserted and monitors activated. Catherine stood frozen, her arms still curved in the shape of where he had been. William kept a hand on her back, his other gripping the doorway to stay upright. But the moment the doctors shut the door, reality punched through. No one knew what was wrong. King Charles arrived within the hour. He had been in a private meeting when the call came in, but the moment he heard Louis, he stood and walked out without another word. No guards, no press, no palace protocol. Just a grandfather, arriving to face the unthinkable. When he entered the private waiting room, he found William pacing like a caged animal, and Catherine sitting motionless, staring at nothing. Charles didn't say anything at first. He simply sat between them, reaching for both their hands. That single gesture said more than words ever could. Doctors came and went, delivering vague updates wrapped in medical jargon. They spoke of high fevers, aggressive testing, possible infections, and immune responses, but no answers. Louis remained unresponsive, drifting in and out of consciousness. Monitors beeped ominously. A machine hissed beside his bed, trying to force oxygen into tired lungs. Nurses worked with quiet urgency, avoiding eye contact, and the media knew nothing. The world continued turning, unaware that within hospital walls a royal crisis was unfolding. One of the monarchy's youngest was slipping away, and neither power nor title could stop it. But as doctors scrambled for answers, it was the silence from Louis that shattered everyone's heart the most. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stared into space, lost. As days passed with no diagnosis, the family realized they weren't just battling an illness. They were unraveling a mystery of the soul. And the answer, when it came, would devastate them. Louis lay in the hospital bed, eyes occasionally flickering open, but not truly seeing. There were no frantic calls for his mother, no reach for his father's hand. Just a haunting stillness, as if he had drifted too far into himself to find his way back. The doctors spoke of vital stabilizing, of promising signs, but none of it brought comfort. Because it wasn't the fever that terrified William and Catherine anymore, it was the eerie silence that had replaced their son. When Catherine whispered his name, he turned his head ever so slightly. But the spark, the cheeky glimmer that had once defined Louis, was gone. William watched his son with growing dread. This wasn't just a child recovering from illness. This was a little boy emotionally vanishing in front of their eyes. No test could detect what was now painfully clear. Something had broken inside him. As the hours stretched into days, the palace became a place of whispers. Staff members recalled moments that now seemed too significant to ignore. A housekeeper admitted she'd found Louis curled in a corner behind the nursery chair, unmoving, eyes glazed. The cook confessed that even his favorite treats had been returned untouched for weeks. The once vibrant child had slowly been dimming, and no one had put the pieces together in time. Catherine replayed those memories with relentless guilt. The time Louis walked out of Charlotte's tea party, the football games he refused with George, the bedtime stories that ended in silence instead of laughter. How many times had she kissed his head and missed the sadness in his eyes? How many nights had he cried quietly into his pillow while she lay asleep in the next room? Unaware, the weight of it all pressed down like iron. George asked fewer questions now, but his quiet looks betrayed his confusion. Charlotte cried often, hiding her face in cushions, unable to understand why her little brother no longer wanted to play. And in the middle of it all, William stood helpless. The man who would be king could not even reach his own son. He began to suspect that grief alone could not explain the transformation. This wasn't just about Catherine's illness. This was about fear, isolation, a belief so painful it had drained the joy from Louis's spirit. William started to wonder if Louis had been silently carrying something they had all overlooked. A belief so damaging it had silenced the boy who once lit up every room he entered. But the breaking point didn't come from Louis. It came from Catherine, in the most unexpected and tragic way. She had survived cancer. She had stood tall through every public challenge. But watching her child suffer in silence, that broke her. In a hospital corridor, Catherine collapsed, not just physically, but emotionally. And for the first time, the world saw a future queen completely undone. It began with a nurse's update brief, clinical and unhelpful. Still no diagnosis, she said gently, trying to soften the blow. But for Catherine, it landed like a hammer. She had clung to hope with every hour that passed. Every blood test, every scan, every whispered conversation behind glass. She had endured it all for the one promise that someone, anyone, would finally explain what was happening to her son. And now, with those 5 words, that hope shattered. She didn't fall gracefully. There was no royal composure. Her legs simply gave out, her body crumpling against the corridor wall. Sobs tore from her chest with a rawness that silenced the room. She wept not like a duchess nor a princess, but like a mother facing the unthinkable. William dropped to his knees beside her without hesitation, gathering her into his arms as if trying to hold her together through sheer force. But he was broken too. The man who had been a pillar throughout Catherine's illness now found himself collapsing beside her, undone by the agony of watching helplessly as their son drifted further away. It was in this moment, this harrowing, silent collapse, that King Charles turned the corner. And for all his years of royal discipline, of maintaining composure under the harshest lights, even he was unprepared for what he saw. His daughter-in-law sobbing uncontrollably on the cold floor. His son, pale and trembling, whispering words of comfort that no longer carried weight. This wasn't a moment for titles or protocol. This was pure human grief. Charles sank to the floor beside them with difficulty, ignoring the sharp protest of his knees. He placed a steady hand on Catherine's shoulder, offering not wisdom, but presence. "You are not alone in this," he said, voice cracked with a depth of emotion he rarely showed. His words were not grand, but they grounded them. For in that corridor, stripped of ceremony and press cameras, they were just a family in crisis. The staff maintained a respectful distance, but their faces showed it all: shock, sadness, helplessness. These were men and women trained to protect, to serve, to maintain structure in chaos. But against the storm of emotion pouring from the royal family, they could do nothing, and that helplessness stung. For hours, Catherine had held herself together, wearing the mask expected of her. But Louis's silence, his ghostly gaze, the absence of laughter, had finally become too much. She wept for the child who had once made every room brighter, for the questions he no longer asked, for the joy he no longer showed, for the fear he carried silently, and for the love that hadn't been enough to shield him. William held her tighter, his own tears now flowing freely. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I don't know how to fix this." And that was the most terrifying part. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with action or power. This was a wound buried deep within a child's soul. And just as despair swallowed the palace, Louis opened his mouth and changed everything with one simple confession. He looked up with trembling lips and eyes full of tears. "I thought you were going to replace me," he whispered. And in that moment, William broke, a father's heart shattered by a child's misunderstood world, a truth more painful than any illness. The silence had stretched for days, but it was broken not by a scream, not by a cry, but by a sentence that cut through the royal family like a blade. William had been sitting beside Louis's hospital bed, trying again to reach his youngest child through soft questions and gentle reassurances. Catherine had been reading aloud in hopes of restoring a sense of calm. But it was Louis, pale and frail, who finally spoke. And what he said was a revelation no one could have prepared for. "I thought you were going to replace me." Time stood still. William froze. Catherine stopped breathing. The words were simple, but their meaning was earth-shattering. For months, Louis had carried the unbearable belief that his place in the family and his value was conditional. He had watched his mother disappear into a world of treatments and hushed conversations. He had overheard snippets about future changes, and in his young mind, it all added up to one horrifying conclusion. They didn't have room for him anymore. Rumors of a new baby, whispered by staff and half heard behind closed doors, had planted a seed that grew into fear. In Louis's eyes, a baby meant someone new to love someone more important, someone who wouldn't need reminders to eat or coaxing to smile. So he did the only thing his heart could manage. He faded quietly, hoping his silence would make him easier to keep. William stood and walked to the hospital window. He pressed his hand to the glass. His other hand clenched so tightly, it trembled. Silent sobs overtook him. He had survived scandals, pressure, the burden of an entire monarchy, but nothing had prepared him for this. To hear that his child believed he was disposable was a pain that tore through him more brutally than anything the crown had ever demanded. Catherine moved closer to Louis, her voice low and urgent. She told him there was never a moment, not even during her darkest days, when she didn't love him beyond words. She told him that no baby, no royal duty, no illness could ever change the place he held in her heart. But Louis wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for certainty. "Promise I'll still be important?" he asked, voice cracking under the weight of months of self-doubt. William turned from the window, crossing the room with urgency. He knelt beside the bed and took Louis's hand with trembling resolve. "You will always be important. You will always be loved. You are ours, and no one could ever replace you." His words weren't rehearsed or polished. They were raw, desperate, and real. But healing a heart broken by misunderstanding takes more than promises, it takes transformation. They were future king and queen, yes, but they had just failed as parents. And that realization cut deeper than any crown could soothe. That night, William and Catherine vowed to never again miss the quiet cries of their children. Everything would change, starting now. In the quiet hours after Louis's confession, the hospital room was filled not with medical alarms or staff chatter, but with the overwhelming sound of guilt. William sat in silence, his fingers locked, his head bowed. Catherine stared blankly at the sleeping form of their son. The weight of every missed sign, every misunderstood moment crashing down all at once. They had faced crises before: public scrutiny, royal scandal, illness. But this was different. This was personal. And this one had slipped past them unnoticed, leaving their child in emotional ruins. They talked long into the night, not about logistics or protocol, but about pain, about the games Louis had refused to play, the meals left untouched, the bedtime routines that ended in quiet tension. They had mistaken his withdrawal for grief, his silence for adjustment. They had assumed he was strong because he didn't cry. But in truth, he had been crumbling. and they hadn't seen it not soon enough. Catherine, her voice hoarse with emotion, made her decision without hesitation. Every non-essential royal duty, every public engagement, every scheduled speech, they would wait. For the next 3 months, I belong to my children, she said, not as a royal figure, not as the Duchess of Cambridge, but as their mother, the one they needed to feel safe, heard, and loved again. William followed suit. He reached out to his private staff with an urgency they hadn't seen before. His calendar was stripped of all unnecessary commitments. If Louis needs me, I must be there, he told them firmly. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration. The monarchy could wait, his son could not. The next day, they brought in a team of child psychologists, experts who didn't speak in riddles or sugarcoat the truth. They listened, observed, and explained what William and Catherine had feared. Louis hadn't simply been sad. He had felt abandoned, forgotten, and that belief, planted and watered by circumstance, had grown into despair. The healing would be long, and it had to be intentional. They took every suggestion seriously. They redesigned their home schedule, creating one-on-one time with each child. They established new bedtime rituals, ones rooted in consistency and love. They started a daily truth hour, where any question could be asked, any fear voiced, and nothing would be dismissed. Slowly, they began the process of earning back the trust they hadn't even realized they had lost. For William and Catherine, it was a reckoning, not with the public or the press, but with themselves. With the roles they had balanced for so long, and the cost they hadn't calculated. They had built a life where duty came first. But now, they were building something else. A sanctuary where their children came before all. But one unexpected figure would play a profound role in Louis's healing. His grandfather, the king. He had reigned over nations, but now he faced his most sacred duty, healing his grandson's heart. In a quiet hospital room, King Charles became not a monarch, but a grandfather. And his words would help bring Louis back to life. Charles had spent his reign walking the tightrope between tradition and evolution. He had stood before parliaments, dignitaries, and global cameras. But no moment in his public life prepared him for what he witnessed. In that corridor, the future queen collapsed, his son hollowed out by helplessness, and his grandson slipping away behind silent eyes. The grief in that hospital was not ceremonial. It was real. And for once, the king had no advisors, no briefings, only instinct. Later that day, he pulled William aside. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't even advice. It was raw honesty. I should have noticed too, he said, his voice thick with regret. He looked quiet at Balmoral. I assumed he was just tired. William didn't respond, but the admission cut through the isolation he'd been drowning in. For the first time in days, he felt like someone else carried the weight with him. Then Charles did something unthinkable. He offered to take over. Not forever, but for now. Public duties, appearances, all of it. He told William and Catherine they were needed elsewhere at their son's bedside, not at palace gates. He spoke not as a sovereign, but as a father who understood what it meant to fall short and try to make it right. From that day on, Charles visited Louis daily. Sometimes he brought small objects. A smooth garden stone Louis once gave him as a toddler now returned like a talisman. Other days, it was a book about elephants, referencing a childhood trip where Louis had declared he would become a zoo boss. The gestures were simple, but they weren't random. They were pieces of Louis's forgotten joy, handed back piece by piece. In one visit, Charles sat quietly while Louis fiddled with the corner of his bedsheet. And then, gently, he began to speak. Not about titles or history, but about fear. About the day William was born, and how he had panicked at the idea of not being enough for 2 children. He spoke of Harry's arrival, how he wrestled with guilt, wondering if his love would stretch far enough. Louis listened without speaking, but something shifted in his eyes. The fear that had consumed him suddenly didn't feel so unique. He wasn't alone. "You are not a placeholder, Louis," Charles said quietly. "You are not an extra. You are you, and no one could ever take your place." It wasn't rehearsed. It was true, and Louis knew it. Catherine, too, had her own reckoning. She sat beside Charles after one of the visits, her voice barely above a whisper. I should have seen it. I should have known, but Charles didn't let her spiral. "You were fighting for your life," he said firmly. "And now you're fighting for his. That's what matters." It was in those small moments, wrapped in unspoken forgiveness and quiet reassurance, that healing began. Not from doctors, not from medication, but from presence. From love shown not through ceremony, but through time, truth, and shared vulnerability. And then, slowly, miraculously, the boy who had vanished began to return. First, it was a smile. Then, a biscuit eaten. Then, a quiet giggle during story time. Prince Louis, the light of the monarchy, was coming back. And every tiny moment of joy felt like a miracle. But it wasn't just healing. It was rebirth. The shift didn't happen in a blaze. It crept in like dawn. Gentle, slow, almost imperceptible at first. One morning, Catherine brought in a small plate of biscuits, and instead of pushing them away, as he had done for weeks, Louis took one. No prompting, no pleading, just a simple decision. He nibbled quietly. And for William and Catherine, that quiet act felt louder than a royal decree. It was the first real sign that the walls around their son were starting to crack. That same day, Charles walked in with the familiar elephant book under his arm, the one Louis had once loved so fiercely. Louis's eyes tracked the book, and for a long second, the room held its breath. "Will you read it again?" he asked softly. That question echoed like a bell through Catherine's soul, because it wasn't just about a story, it was a request to connect, to be seen again, to belong. In the days that followed, more light returned. George dared to bring the football back out to the hospital garden. At first, Louis just watched from a bench. Then he stood. Then he kicked. And when he scored barefoot, with clumsy joy, George whooped so loudly, the nurses came running. Charlotte, ever the imaginative soul, laid out a blanket tea party with stuffed animals in Louis's hospital room. And this time, he joined her, not just out of obligation, but with curiosity and laughter that hadn't been heard in months. The staff, who had once tiptoed around the fragile quiet of the royal wing, now smiled again. A nurse was seen wiping a tear when Louis jokingly asked if she had been trained by dragons. A security guard laughed out loud when Louis organized a guard parade using stuffed toys and royal titles he made up on the spot. Everyone, from the highest aide to the humblest cleaner, felt the weight lifting. Because Louis wasn't just a boy, he was the soul of the space. And his recovery was everyone's reward. William and Catherine were no longer just surviving beside his bed. They were living again with him. Catherine brushed his hair and asked him what new animal he wanted to learn about. William brought in a toy microscope to explore tiny royal germs. And Louis's laugh was so sharp and clear that William had to excuse himself to hide the tears it triggered. But this new Louis wasn't exactly the same boy they had known. He was still mischievous, still bright, but there was a quiet strength now, a wisdom in his eyes that hadn't been there before, as if he had traveled through something few children ever do, and returned holding pieces of both innocence and resilience in equal measure. And while the family embraced this miraculous return, the larger world remained unaware. Questions were beginning to swirl. Why had appearances stopped? Why was there silence from Adelaide Cottage? The palace couldn't hold the truth forever. But even as healing blooms again in the royal gardens, the palace must decide how and if they'll reveal this chapter to the world. The world watched for news. Speculation soared, and then, together, King Charles and Prince William stood before the nation, their eyes heavy, their message clear. The monarchy had faced a storm, and the youngest among them bore the deepest scars. But they were finally ready to tell the world the truth. For weeks, the silence had grown deafening. Public appearances were abruptly cancelled. Social media went dark. Rumours churned in tabloids and whisper networks, some absurd, others dangerously close to the truth. Why had Louis vanished from sight? What was the real reason behind the royal family's retreat from the spotlight? The pressure to speak became a storm the palace could no longer contain. And so, behind closed doors, a difficult decision was made. The statement would not be clinical. It would not be cold. This would be personal. Crafted with care and compassion, every word was debated, every sentence reviewed through the lens of truth and dignity. And when the moment came, the monarchy didn't hide behind press secretaries. King Charles and Prince William stood side by side, presenting not just a united front, but a family stepping into vulnerability together. The official announcement was clear and composed. Prince Louis had experienced what was described as a significant health and emotional episode that had required both urgent medical attention and sustained family support. It spoke of healing, of progress, but also of hardship. The statement did not shy away from acknowledging that even the youngest members of the royal family are not immune to the emotional toll of change, fear, and overwhelming life events. Then came Catherine's voice, written but deeply felt. Her brief note, attached to the public statement, thanked the nation for its patience, understanding, and unwavering kindness. She expressed gratitude for the medical professionals who had stood beside them through uncertainty, and above all, for the love shown toward their son. She admitted, candidly, that their family had faced one of its darkest seasons. But she also said, with quiet conviction, that they were emerging from it stronger, more grounded, and forever changed. The reaction from the public was immediate. Waves of sympathy, respect, and admiration flooded in from around the globe. Hashtags trended, vigils were held, and children across the UK wrote letters to Louis, telling him he was not alone. News anchors dropped their polished tones and spoke with genuine emotion. Mental health advocates praised the palace for breaking the silence around emotional trauma in children. And, for the first time in a long while, the monarchy felt human, fallible, transparent, and brave. But inside the palace walls, one truth remains unspoken. What will this mean for the future of the royal children and the monarchy itself? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.